Welcome to Military Chronicle. The images appearing on your screen right now represent a nation in the throes of an existential nightmare, where the citizens of a once proud regional power are no longer waiting for political reform, but for a miracle of basic survival. In the spring of 2026, the intersection of chronic hunger, agonizing thirst, and a growing tide of civil resistance is rapidly transforming into a full-scale revolution. We are looking at the heart of Tehran, a metropolis that entered the 21st century with aspirations of becoming a global nuclear power. Yet today, this ancient seat of Persian civilization faces the most profound logistical and social chaos in its modern history. This is not an isolated incident in the capital. From the holy city of Qom to the industrial hubs of Isfahan and Mashhad, and stretching across the plains to Hamadan, the structural integrity of the Iranian state is fracturing. The regime, led by the administration in Tehran, is currently confronting what experts describe as the most significant civil collapse in recorded history, as millions of Iranians refuse to remain passive witnesses to their own destruction. The narrative of a powerful, defiant state is being replaced by the reality of a regime that has effectively dismantled itself through decades of systemic incompetence and environmental neglect. By mid-century, Tehran has transitioned from a defiant nuclear aspirant to a desperate beggar of water, unable to provide the most fundamental necessity of life to its own people, while simultaneously threatening the international community with advanced missile technology. The irony is as sharp as it is tragic. A nation that boasts of hypersonic capabilities cannot ensure a single drop of water flows from the taps in its own capital. Reports indicate that the government has even begun the humiliating process of pleading with its neighbors for liquid relief. In the streets, the desperation is palpable. These are not lines for bread or subsidized fuel, but chaotic scrambles where millions of Iranians, clutching empty plastic jerry cans and rusted metal tins, push against one another in a frantic bid to secure enough water to survive the night. When the taps are turned on, they do not offer water, but instead emit a hollow hiss of air and the haunting sound of systemic despair. This is the precise moment where civilization, as a structured entity, begins to collapse. This reality is so dire that President Masoud Pezeshkian has effectively raised the white flag of surrender to the environmental and logistical forces now ravaging the country. On the military front, the situation is even more harrowing. Reports from the forward lines indicate that Iranian soldiers are being issued a mere 20 bullets each, a staggering statistic that signals the total breakdown of the national defense supply chain. What truly haunts the generals in Tehran today is not the threat of Israeli F-35 stealth fighters or the presence of American carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf. Rather, it is the simple, clear liquid that should be flowing from the pipes, or more accurately, the void left by its absence. As regional tensions simmer, the pressure on the military apparatus has reached a breaking point, and the details emerging from this report are nothing short of terrifying. We will examine these developments with the gravity they deserve, beginning with the 20-bullet crisis. Logistical supply lines have been so severely disrupted that units at the front are being forced to share ammunition, with some reports suggesting 20 rounds are being split between two soldiers. Yet, this shortage of munitions is merely the tip of the iceberg. Field units across multiple regions are reportedly operating without any access to reliable potable water or sufficient food rations. An army of 1 million personnel, once the pride of the Islamic Republic, is being systematically decimated not by enemy fire, but by the biological imperatives of hunger and thirst. Under these conditions, it is a physical and psychological impossibility for any military force to maintain its discipline or its loyalty to the central command. Iran is currently facing the most severe water crisis in modern history, with water levels in the critical dams supplying Tehran falling below the 6% threshold. To put this in perspective, the Iranian military machine consists of approximately 190,000 members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and 350,000 regular army troops. This force of over 500,000 soldiers requires far more than the ammunition they carry. They require a massive, constant influx of water to remain combat effective. However, the Iranian state can no longer provide this, signaling the arrival of a day zero that traditional media outlets and social media platforms often hesitate to discuss. Despite the risks of algorithmic suppression, the truth must be told using the most precise data available. To understand the gravity of this water bankruptcy in a military context, one must consider the requirements of a modern soldier. According to NATO standards and climate data specific to the Middle East, a soldier engaged in active combat, carrying 30 to 40 kilograms of equipment while managing extreme stress and physical exertion, requires between 15 and 20 liters of water per day. This is not merely for drinking. It is essential for basic hygiene to prevent the rapid spread of disease, for the preparation of dehydrated rations, and for the maintenance of medical services. Furthermore, water is a critical industrial component for cooling systems, vehicle maintenance, and the operation of heavy machinery. For a force of over 500,000 personnel, the daily water requirement in a wartime scenario reaches into the millions of liters. In times of relative peace, this demand can be met by local wells or municipal networks, but in a state of active conflict, where power plants are primary targets and pumps fall silent, the source of this water vanishes. Iran's traditional military doctrine, which emphasizes a war of attrition and the use of difficult terrain to exhaust an adversary, is fundamentally undermined by this hydrological reality. If the energy grid is compromised by cyber attacks or kinetic strikes, the water treatment plants will cease to function entirely, and the current reserves are insufficient to sustain any prolonged military engagement. The logistical burden of transporting millions of liters of water to the front lines using thousands of tanker trucks would be one of the most difficult operations in military history, tripling the existing logistical load. These water tankers, slow-moving and highly vulnerable, would become the primary strategic targets for enemy drones and airstrikes. The destruction of a single water convoy could immobilize an entire battalion within 24 hours. The biological limits of the human body are non-negotiable. While a soldier might survive without food for weeks, the loss of combat effectiveness due to dehydration occurs in a matter of hours. The cognitive function of a radar operator, the steady hand of a pilot, and the physical endurance of an infantryman all collapse without hydration. Even the most fanatical and well-trained soldier cannot resist the effects of severe dehydration for more than 72 hours, after which kidney failure and total cognitive breakdown are inevitable. The Iranian military is now facing the very real prospect of being defeated by its own geography. An even more terrifying scenario involves potential attacks on the already depleted dam infrastructure. While dams are usually considered strategic assets, in Iran's current state, they have become strategic liabilities. Most are either empty or filled with unusable silt, and the loss of hydroelectric power has already crippled the nation's energy production. In the event of a total grid collapse, the civilian population in the rear will face catastrophic thirst before the first shots of a major war are even fired. A professional army cannot fight a war on the border when a thirsty and rebellious population is rioting in the cities behind them. This was made clear on December 3, 2025, when Energy Minister Abbas Ali-Abadi appeared before the cameras, not to announce a new strategy, but to effectively signal the regime's capitulation. By officially stating that Iran would seek water from its neighbors, the minister confessed a shameful truth that had been hidden for decades. For a regional power that prides itself on its nuclear program, this was a moment of supreme diplomatic humiliation. The government in Tehran had succeeded in enriching uranium, but it had fundamentally failed to fill the cups of its citizens. Perhaps the most tragicomic aspect of this desperation was the regime's decision to negotiate with the Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan for access to basic water sources. This highlights Tehran's precipitous fall in the regional hierarchy. Internally, the situation is even more volatile. Reports from the Institute for the Study of War suggest that high-ranking officials are privately discussing the evacuation of portions of Tehran. The logistical and humanitarian implications of evacuating a city of 15 million people are unprecedented. Where would they go? Other major cities like Isfahan, Yazd, and Kerman are already struggling with their own terminal droughts. This perception of state failure is fueling a dangerous sentiment among the populace, that the regime's incompetence is a greater threat than any foreign missile. The water riots seen in Khuzestan province in recent years were merely a prelude to a much larger social explosion. In a wartime scenario, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would face an impossible dilemma: whether to deploy its dwindling resources to fight an external enemy at the border or to suppress millions of thirsty citizens rioting in the streets. This division of security forces is a strategist's nightmare. Each day the regime fails to resolve this crisis, it pulls the pin on its own internal time bomb. President Pezeshkian's warnings reflect the fragility of the system, yet no easy solutions exist. Real reform would require a radical overhaul of agricultural policies and the dismantling of the very dams that provide illicit profit to the IRGC and the local elites. To truly understand the collapse of Iran, we must use the correct terminology. This is not a temporary drought, but a permanent, structural water bankruptcy. According to data from early 2026, Iran extracts approximately 63.8 billion cubic meters of groundwater annually, while the natural replenishment rate from rain and snow is only 45 billion. This deficit has been managed by consuming ancient aquifers that took thousands of years to form. In military terms, this is the equivalent of a besieged army tearing down its own castle walls to use the stones as projectiles. Eventually, there are no more stones and there is no more castle. As of January 2026, the levels in 4 of the 5 main reservoirs supplying the capital are hovering between 6% and 10%, a range known in hydrology as dead volume, where the water is so heavily mixed with sediment and toxic sludge that it is technically and economically unfeasible to purify. Satellite imagery from 2024 through 2026 confirms that massive reservoirs like Latian and Karaj have essentially turned to dust. When a state can no longer provide water to its capital, it loses the last vestiges of its legitimacy. The primary architect of this disaster is, ironically, the organization tasked with protecting the state, the IRGC. The engineering arm of the Guard, Khatam al-Anbiya, has overseen the construction of more than 600 dams over the last 3 decades, often without environmental impact studies, and solely for the purpose of generating massive profits for IRGC-linked firms. The most egregious example is the Gotvan Dam on the Karun River, which was built atop the Gachcharan Salt Formation, despite repeated warnings from geologists. When the reservoir filled, the salt dissolved, rendering the water more saline than the ocean and destroying hundreds of thousands of acres of fertile farmland and millions of date palms. Experts now describe this as a form of state-sponsored ecological suicide. History teaches us that water scarcity is the most potent catalyst for social upheaval. People can endure the loss of political freedom, but they cannot endure the loss of life itself. In the oil-rich but water-poor Khuzestan, the anger has already boiled over, with farmers attacking water pipelines and government buildings. If the IRGC is forced to redirect its logistics and personnel to maintain domestic order against the thirsty populace, Iran will be left completely exposed to external aggression. This situation illustrates a shift in global geopolitics. While missiles and nuclear proxies are metrics of power, the ultimate foundation of state survival is ecological. Iran is currently a sandcastle state, imposing and formidable from the outside, but built on foundations of dry riverbeds and salt-encrusted earth. While sanctions and cyber attacks have weakened the infrastructure, it is the biological collapse caused by water mismanagement that is bringing the regime to its knees. The dream of a self-sufficient Islamic republic is dying alongside its lakes. As the waters recede, a toxic legacy remains. 10 billion tons of salt and dried chemicals from the desiccated beds of Lake Urmia are being picked up by the wind, creating salt tsunamis that fill the lungs of millions. In Tehran and Urmia, respiratory diseases and cancers are skyrocketing, forcing the population to live in an invisible gas chamber of toxic dust. In this vacuum of authority, a water mafia has emerged in the streets of Tehran, controlling the distribution of what little remains. The sovereignty of the nation is being traded for gallons of water, marking the end of an era. Thank you for tuning in to Military Chronicle. To stay informed on these critical global developments and to support our continued reporting, please remember to